Hello, art historians, and welcome to our first part of our lectures over Egypt, where we're going to start out by creating the context. So, at the same time that Mesopotamia was thriving, not far away is going to be Egypt and their civilization. And as they establish as a civilization, their art and architecture is going to establish with it. Now, we're going to see some similarities between Mesopotamia and Egypt in terms of the fact that it is mainly about the two R's, religion and rule. However, we are going to see some major differences due to the fact that Egypt was a much more stable and calm area with much less hostility around it than Mesopotamia had. So I wanted to start just by showing you some pictures of, this is actually some pictures from the cemetery where I am a tour guide, located in St. Louis. It's Bellefontaine Cemetery. And you can see right here that these are some examples of obelisks that we have in our cemetery. We have a lot of them, actually. And obelisks actually came from Egypt, and they're very prominent in our cemetery, and in a lot of cemeteries from around the 1840s and 1850s that were created around the world. And one of the reasons for this, there are other reasons we will talk about later, mainly the discovery of things like King Tut's tomb that made people go a little bit Egyptian crazy, or Napoleon whenever he found the Rosetta Stone, and people kind of revived their interest in Egypt. But the Egyptians have this view of the afterlife that really is unlike anybody else. It really not something that was scary. It was much more a sense of peace and just a transition in life. And because of that view, in times of really bad hardships, like in America during the Industrial Revolution or Europe during the Industrial Revolution, when life expectancies weren't very long and life was pretty, tough and hard and dog eat dog, there needed to be this idea of, if this life wasn't so great, at least the next life could possibly be. So we start to see in cemeteries all over the United States and in Europe this Egyptian feel that shows up because of their kind of unique viewpoint on how the afterlife played a role in people's existence. This is actually another one, the one here to the right. This is Sterling Price that's in Bellefontaine Cemetery where I work. It's one of our biggest obelisks. But then this is actually on the left from Graceland Cemetery in Chicago. And you can see that it's got that modified pyramid shape, and it's got a sphinx laying outside of it. And right smack dab here in the middle, you can actually see the sun, which represented Ra. So kind of like this idea of adopting not only Egyptian architecture, but kind of like their overall outlook on this life and the next life, and that death wasn't something to be feared. It was just a transition into this next plane of existence, and maybe even better than all the suffering that takes place in this world. So why is there such this interest in Egypt? Why is it so pervasive? I know whenever I wanted to become a history teacher, one of the very first things I was interested in like sixth grade was Egypt. And I remember getting a textbook that had King Tut's sarcophagus on it, just thinking that was the coolest thing because I would learn about Egypt. But why is there such an interest in Egypt? Number one, we know a lot about them. They were very, very determined to make sure that people remembered them, and they left their mark all over Egypt in terms of the buildings that they did and the decorations that they put on it and the statues that they put around their civilization. However, even though we know a lot about them, they're still very mysterious and kind of odd in the fact that they seem to have this understanding of what life after death meant in a way that other cultures and other people really didn't. Plus, we've had a lot of discoveries with Egypt in history that have made people kind of go Egyptian crazy. So, 1799, as I mentioned, Napoleon invades Egypt and he finds the Rosetta Stone, and now suddenly we can decode hieroglyphics, and that becomes like this key to unlocking this mysterious culture that we were trying to figure out for hundreds of years prior. And then in 1922, Howard Carter actually discovers the tomb of King Tut, which had never actually been disturbed, and it was this great artifactual find. And as a result of that, it kind of kicked up that fascination with Egypt again. In the Roaring '20s, in fact, they would have King Tut type of parties. So it was just kind of this culture that seems, people want to be them and understand them because they seem to have this grasp on life that other cultures don't. So what do we know about them since Napoleon? What have we uncovered about the Egyptians? Well, we know, number one, that everything about their civilization rested on the Nile, which flooded very, very regularly. It was every source of life for them, for irrigation, for the crops to feed this massive civilization. And therefore, everything revolves around making sure that predictability continues, which is why I say with Egypt, it's if it ain't broke, don't fix it, because everything that they kept doing kept working. The Nile kept flooding, people kept being fed, their society was very successful. So for 3,000 years, roughly, Egyptian art really isn't going to change. They're just going to keep doing the exact same things over and over and over again, except for one little random blip that's in the middle of it. So we are going to see the two R's really combined here in this idea of making sure that civilization continued, because they believed that their pharaohs, when they died, they could control whether the Nile flooded or not, because they were the sons of Ra and would eventually go back to being part of the sun god. So as a result of that, you wanted to make sure that the pharaohs, especially in their afterlife, were very pleased and very happy, because then the Nile would keep flooding. So everything that they were doing seemed to keep working. So that's what they kept doing. Here's a crazy part. There is in Egyptian no word for like art as we know it. So art in our minds is decorative and kind of, created to be something to be looked at. That wasn't the case in art with Egypt. Their art was functional. They didn't even consider it art in the sense that we do. Like everything had a purpose. It was, and even though it decorates literally everything they could get it on, it's not actually for any purpose other than to serve a function. It's not decorative. It's not meant to be pretty or, oh, look what we painted. Aren't we creative? No, it's meant to all have a very specific purpose. So again, we also know that a lot of this revolved around this cult of the afterlife, and that their view of the afterlife was that this truly was just another extension of the life that they lived on this earth. It's not scary. It's not really mysterious. As far as they were concerned, they had this figured out. And again, it became kind of this obsession during the industrial ages of the 17 and 1800s, when life expectancies were short and death was imminent. And adopting an Egyptian outlook was kind of a way to make it less scary in a way. So if the pharaoh is a god, he becomes, when he dies, he becomes part of the pantheon of gods. And so therefore, if the gods and the pharaohs were happy after death, then everything would continue working the way that it always had. So the higher you are in society, the closer you are to speaking to the gods and making sure that things work right. So if you were of higher status, like for example, the royal hairdresser, then you would actually make sure that you were kept happy in the afterlife by the things that they used their art for. So really early on in their rule, pharaohs would start making sure that their tomb would be built and how it would be stocked and what their final resting place would look like and what would it have in it, because it's early estate planning. They're making sure that after they die, they're going to have everything that they need in the next life. So this is where mummification comes in and why this was such a big deal to the Egyptians. So they believed that your soul had three parts to it. So there was your Ak, which lived with the gods, a Ba, which would communicate between the two worlds, and then there was your Ka. And the Ka was kind of like your soul in terms of what we understand it to be. And this could basically roam around on this earth, away from the body, and then inhabit things that looked like that individual. So for example, a statue that looked like the pharaoh, or the body. And you don't want that Ka to be unhappy. You want to make sure that it has everything that it needs, that it liked in life. So food or drinks or servants or music or horses or chariots. King Tut's tomb had chariots in it and jewelry and all of the things that he liked in life. But if that Ka was going to visit the body, it needed to be able to recognize that body. And the more intact the body was in death, the more it would be in the afterlife. So for example, if somebody is buried with no tongue, like maybe that was a punishment that their tongue was cut out or their eyes were cut out, they believed that that soul would be in the afterlife with no tongue, with no eyes, would be miserable and could potentially wreak some havoc if it was unhappy. So you made sure when the body was mummified that you kept it preserved as long as possible for when that soul needed to come back and visit. So you keep it in as good a shape as you can. So you remove all the organs except for the heart, which you actually need to get into the afterlife because they weigh your heart to see if it's pure, if you lived a good life or not. And then you had all of your organs placed in canopic jars. Your body was completely drained out of all fluids. It was leaned at an angle so it would drain out, and it was packed full of salt to dry it. And then after it was all dried out of any moisture, they would pack it full of like cloth and linen to make sure it had the right shape. Then they would wrap it up, and then you would be put in a sarcophagus that usually had a mask of the face of that person. So that way the Ka could actually recognize it as, oh, that's my body. That's where I'm supposed to be going. So this way, the Ka could inhabit the mummified body. It could inhabit statues that looked like it. It could go into pictures that looked like it. But you needed to make sure that those statues or that body was in as good a condition as it possibly could be, so that if the Ka was happy, the Ba was happy, and then the Ak would make sure that things were going well up in the afterlife. So again, this kept working. This is what they did. They kept making the art look the same way, and they kept mummifying, and they kept following the same procedures. And as a result, everything kept happening. The Nile kept flooding. Everything was okay. So if the Pharaoh's soul is happy, everything is good. So we do everything we can to make sure that the Pharaoh is happy in his next life. So it's all about displaying permanence, where Mesopotamia is full of change. Like different city-states change, different rulers change, and they may choose to adopt certain things or make their own changes on things. Egypt is about permanence and making sure that everything is the same so that the Nile would remain permanent. So what the Egyptians believed is in balance, that everything was about achieving this ideal harmony between this world and the next world. So what they focused on was this idea of Mat, which is harmony. So you wanted to make sure that there's balance between all things, between humans and the environment, particularly the Nile, so that everything keeps going okay. And the gods usually had a good and a bad side, so that way they could help even things out. So it was all about things staying even keel, things not getting thrown out of balance, and making sure that everything was stable to, kind of represent that idea of Mat. So you can see here in Egypt, you don't see a lot of one thing. You don't see a lot of odd numbers. You see things in pairs or even numbers. So if you're going to have statues, there needs to be 4. If there's going to be obelisks, there needs to be a pair. If you're going to have an entryway, there needs to be a door on each side. Everything is all about balance and making sure that everything stays as stable as possible without literally rocking the boat. So again, here's another example. You see perfect balance on each side. You see 2 entrances. Everything is set here so that nothing gets rocked out of place. Everything is set and stable. So what does this mean for Egyptian art? Well, there's going to be 3 major art periods of Egyptian art. So there's Old Kingdom, which is when they're really establishing themselves as Upper and Lower Egypt. And this is kind of when the rules and standards are set. Like, this is what we're going to do, this is what we need to do, this is what is working, this is what we're going to continue. Middle Kingdom is going to be when they make some modifications, but not really changes, just kind of changing the way they do things, but not necessarily the way the art works. And then New Kingdom, all right, is going to be a little bit more elaborate, but still kind of the same ideas. So here's what I need you to understand. In Egypt, they're going to have 31 dynasties or ruling families that are going to rule over 3,000 years. And throughout that, even though there's 31 dynasties and 3 different time periods we go through, Egyptian art will never really change. And it will be entirely focused on those 2 ideas of religion and rule in some form, no matter what. So we're going to stop there, and you guys are going to start by, since the Old Kingdom is where we're beginning, we're going to start looking at how Egypt set the rules that are going to be in place for the next 3,000 years. And we're going to start by looking at this work of art, which is the Narmer palette.